Okay.
Oh, hi, boys and girls. Welcome to Storytime with Nonie. I am so excited because today we're going to go to someplace very special. But I'm not going to tell you where until we get there. So let me grab my coat and Finnegan and our book, and off we go. If you remember, the shepherd had led Much Afraid into the desert. Well, they were done with the lessons in the desert, and he began to walk with her. And one day when they got to the special path, he said, "Much Afraid, this is the way I want you to go." And so they walked along together. Much Afraid was very glad that the shepherd was walking with her until they came to a sea. Now, boys and girls, this is not an ocean. This is a lake, but we're going to pretend it's an ocean because it's the closest thing that I have to an ocean near my home. When we go to the ocean, we usually go on vacation. Have you ever been to the ocean with the big waves and the seagulls? And it's a fun place. In fact, it's one of my favorite places right next to Disneyland. Much Afraid was not happy to be by the ocean. And I'll tell you why. Where did she want to be? In the high places, up where the mountains where the shepherd lived in the kingdom of love. And the ocean, boys and girls, is the very lowest place of all. But here she is. And she's like, "Shepherd, are you sure this is where you want me to be?" He said, "Much Afraid, even though your home in the valley is far, far away, and even though the mountains are far, far away, it's time for me to leave you now, but I want you to know something. If you call me, I will be there just like that." She grabbed a hold of the hands of her two helpers, Sorrow and Suffering, and she began to walk along. Much Afraid began to know the name of this place. It was the Sea of Loneliness, because there was nothing here. Sometimes the only sound she would hear would be the crying of the seagulls as they flew overhead. It was very lonely. And she had so much opportunity while she was walking along to practice the lessons that she had learned. Do you remember, boys and girls, what some of those lessons were? Much Afraid pulled the pouch out of her pocket that she had been keeping her lesson stones in. The first one was and that acceptance with joy. She kept thinking about that one. I'm going to accept with joy where the shepherd has me. And you know, it didn't even seem to be all that bad after a while. She was surprised at how easily she was able to walk along. It almost seemed, with her helpers, Sorrow and Suffering, beside her, that she hardly even limped. Meanwhile, the fearing relatives were at home waiting for Pride to bring Much Afraid back. And after all this time, when he didn't show up, they decided he must have failed and was too proud to come home without her. So they sent out spies to find Pride. They sent out spies to find out where Much Afraid was. When her fearing relatives realized she was by the Sea of Loneliness, oh boy, were they excited. And so they chose 3 guys to go along with Pride to bring her back. And they chose resentment, bitterness, and self. Now, resentment is like anger. Bitterness is like poison in your spirit. And it's hatred. And self-pity is when you feel very sorry for yourself. Well, those 3 went and found Pride, and then they set off to find Much Afraid. And they saw Much Afraid down there. And they were getting closer and closer. They soon found out that Much Afraid was not the same person she had been before, because she was holding the hands of her helpers, Sorrow and Suffering, and she wasn't letting go. And because of that, they were not able to get close to her. So, Pride yells out as loud as he could, "Hey, you little Much Afraid! I told you so! Look where you're at! You're near the shores of loneliness. You're not in the high places. I told you the shepherd would take you out here and leave you there. He's never coming back for you." And then Resentment raised his ugly head, and he said, "Who is this shepherd that you're following anyways? Why do you let him treat you like this? He's just cruel. I don't know why you do, why you put up with it. Here you are, in the lowest place of all, desert on one side. You're never going to get to the high places." Very angry, bitterness then began to speak. And he said, "The more you let him, the more cruel things he's going to do to you. You better just turn around and come back with us right now before you're stuck here and can never come back home." Then self-pity began to speak, and self-pity was almost worse than all the others put together, because he spoke in such a soft, whimpering little voice, and he said, "Poor little Much Afraid. You have tried so hard. You've done everything that the shepherd asked you to do. Oh, nothing's ever good enough. Look where you are now. You don't deserve to be here by the shores of loneliness. How long are you gonna let that shepherd keep causing you all this pain?" Pain? That was the wrong word for him to say, or the right word for him to say, because the word pain reminded Much Afraid of all the lessons she had learned while she was in the desert. Do you remember? And the shepherd had taught her that there would be pain, but it would help her become like him. The shepherd had taught her that that kind of pain would draw her to him. You see, resentment and pride and bitterness, self-pity, they were trying to turn her around and make her go the other way. That was torment. That was painful. They wanted her to live in torment, isolate her from the shepherd. They didn't want her to be with the shepherd. But when we experience pain, like sorrow and suffering, that kind of pain draws us to the shepherd. So, without even thinking anymore, Much Afraid had had enough. She reached down and she picked up a rock and she threw it at self-pity, and it surprised him, and all the enemies backed up for a moment. They were shocked. But they did not go away. See, Much Afraid didn't have the experience she needed to know that in the power and authority of the shepherd, she could have told him to leave her. But you know, Much Afraid and Sorrow and Suffering, she never let go of their hands. She kept holding their hands. And they kept walking day after day, and those enemies kept following her closer and closer, as close as they could get. They couldn't touch her, but they kept on attacking her with their words. And Much Afraid was becoming weaker and weaker until she couldn't take it anymore, and all of a sudden she cried out, "Shepherd, come help me!" And immediately, here came the shepherd with his staff raised. Those enemies had experienced that staff before, and they scattered in all directions as fast as they could, running away from the shepherd. Much Afraid, "Oh, shepherd, thank you for coming. Oh, I was trying so hard on my own to make them be quiet and leave me alone. Why couldn't I do it? And the shepherd said, much afraid, I think that perhaps you were impatient with walking along the shores of loneliness for so long. Perhaps you liked what they were saying to you a little bit. Much afraid's cheeks began to get warm because she knew the shepherd was right. How is she going to respond? You see, there's 3 ways we can respond when we're confronted with truth about something that we don't really want to admit. Much afraid could have denied it and said, oh no, that's not how I felt at all. That's not what I thought. Or she could have justified it, made excuses for feeling the way she did, or she could be honest and truthful. And that's the way she chose. She said, oh, shepherd, you're right. I had begun to think that I had walked along here a long time and that maybe you weren't going to keep your promises to me at all and ever come and get me and take me to the high places. But she said, you're right, shepherd. Please forgive me. Please forgive me. I choose to trust you, and I will wait for you. And the shepherd stooped down, and he picked up another little stone, and he said, much afraid, this stone is to remind you to wait patiently for the things that I have told you I will do. I will do them. You have to wait patiently. Put it in your pouch with your other lesson stones and keep it with you tightly to remember my promises and to remember the lessons you have learned. Well, much afraid and her helpers walked for many more days along the shores of loneliness, and much afraid kept the pouch tightly with her, even though her enemies continued to attack her with their words. She was resisting them. She wasn't even paying attention to them anymore. She would sing songs from the great book about her shepherd and her love for him. She was practicing acceptance with joy. She even began to see the beauty of the sea around her and to appreciate the lessons that she was learning there. Much afraid and her helpers walked along the shores of loneliness for many more days. And then one morning, all of a sudden, they arrived at a completely different place. There were trees and wildflowers. Birds were singing. The grass was green. And it felt like Much Afraid had stepped out of winter and into spring. She could hardly believe it. And as she walked around one of the trees, who do you think she met? That's right, there was the shepherd. And she said, oh, shepherd, welcome, 1,000 times welcome. And he said, much afraid, I've come here to bring you a message. She knew what it was. She said, oh, shepherd, is it time for you to take me to the high places? And he just said, now watch and see what I will do. And she knew that was a yes. He was smiling so big. And he said, much afraid, I want you to continue on for a little while, but be prepared and watch and see what I will do. And he just went leaping and bounding off like he has a habit of doing. And Much Afraid felt strength just pouring into her body. And one morning, as Much Afraid was walking up a hill, she got to the top, and all of a sudden, there were the mountains, the high places. Oh, she could hardly believe it. She fell down on her knees and she worshipped God for bringing her to the bottom of the mountains. she realized something else. She was learning to know the language of her helpers' sorrow and suffering, because she was able to understand that they were just as happy and excited as she was. And they continued on their journey for several more days, just waiting to see what the shepherd would do next. Boys and girls, thank you for coming on this journey with me. And I will see you next time on Storytime with Nonie. Love you. Bye-bye. I started thinking that I have been out here a long time, and that maybe your promises to me, like, you were never going to fulfill them. And besides, my hair is just like, how long does it have to be? Frizzy! No, that's pride talking. I better not do that. Get my coat. This is going to be really fun. Uh-oh. Lightning was storming. No!